I'm super excited to get into this content because let's just face it, Dr. Robert and Price has talked about these things. I've had Elaine Pagels come on and talk about these things. Various scholars with different flavors talk about these things. But today, the one that's going to shine the most is M. David Litwa. I hope you guys enjoy going to his blog. Check out his content. He has an old school blog. He calls it that himself. I'm not the one who made that term up. This is just kind of a layback blog that he has. You should check out. This is the book we're going to be discussing, The Evil Creator, Origins of an Early Christian Idea. And I'm excited to see what he says there. You can go also to Amazon. It's in the description. Check out all of his other works. I will not waste any more time. Dr. Litwa, what is this evil God? Take us through what it is.
Well, facetiously, I would say he's the god of COVID-19. And I'm not sure if the pandemic has caused people to change their theology, but maybe it should. But certainly for early Christians, one of the strange ideas, strange to us in the modern world, is that many early Christians, sometimes called Gnostics, actually envisioned the creator of the world as an evil being. Pure evil, sometimes identified with the devil, sometimes not, but nevertheless evil. There was a mediating position of thinkers such as Valentinus, who and his followers, who viewed the creator as just, that is, as righteous, so sort of not really that good, not really evil either, but somewhere in between. And then there was what we might call the early Catholic position, which unquestionably viewed the creator as good. And that position, obviously, is the one that became Christian orthodoxy. But then the question is, what happened to the other viewpoints?
Yeah.
And why did early Christians in that early second century laboratory of ideas, why did they envision the creator of this world as evil? That's the real question. And what I found out is that they viewed the creator of this world as evil for much the same reasons that an atheist today, looking at the Christian Bible, which includes so-called Old and New Testaments, when reading some of that stuff, would also conclude that the creator was evil. And the figure that I most focus on is Marcion. Marcion is unfortunately not that well known, but he really should be, because he is one of the great and greatest of early Christian theologians who was later excoriated and condemned. But just an amazing figure who something gave us our first edition of the New Testament, which for him was a copy of the Gospel of what we think of as Luke. Canonical Luke, many think, was a response to Marcion's version of Luke, which appeared in the 140s. And that version of Luke were told from two people, Tertullian and Epiphanius, who are early church fathers. It didn't have the birth narratives, and it also didn't have, they thought that it was a shortened version. And it didn't have the other certain features that they thought were should be there, which were familiar to them. But basically, this seems to be just a version of the gospel that Marcion was using. It doesn't mean that he shortened it himself. It doesn't mean that he's some crazy editor whacking things off the text. He's later accused of that. That doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, he's not trained. He's not really an intellectual. He's a ship captain. But what happens is Marcion publishes an edition of the letters of Paul, and this text, which he calls the Evangelion, and in front of this, he puts in a text called the Antitheses, and he says, listen, folks, as an introduction to this edition of the Bible, I'm going to tell you the difference between the true God and this deity whom you've learned about in what we think of as the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And I'm going to show you all the differences. And he basically goes through and he says, it just draws these contrasts that are already sort of inherent in the Gospels. And he then concludes that these contrasts are so strong that they can't be talking about the same gods. So, for instance, one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament is Elijah and the she-bears. Okay. Now, if your viewers aren't familiar with the story, this is one of the great gems of the Old Testament, where Elisha is walking toward the city of Bethel, and he's met by, we're told, 40 young lads, and reading the Septuagint, which is the Greek version that Marcion had, these were very young lads, usually thought of as sort of like between the ages of 4 and 10, and they went up to Elisha and they just kind of started making fun of him, saying, "Go on up, Baldy, go on up." We're not exactly sure why they said that, but Elisha's response was interesting, because he stops in his tracks and he starts to pray to the Old Testament deity Yahweh, as he's called today. And Yahweh, he curses the children, and Yahweh immediately responds by sending 2 she-bears, and these she-bears then maul every single one of these kids. And the Greek indicates that, yeah, basically they ate the children, sort of like if you remember, they broke their bones. There's this great scene in the Revenant, with the bear attack, or Revenant as sometimes pronounced, with Leonardo DiCaprio, and where this huge huge she-bear attacks him. And basically that's what happens in this story. It's 2 of these huge she-bears, and they basically kill all these children, and Elisha simply walks on, and as if he's just whistling a tune, and goes on his merry way. And what Marcion said, that I want you to do this. I want you to contrast this story of how the Old Testament deity responds to these children with how Jesus responds to the children. And he compared the story of the famous one where people bring children for Jesus to bless, and the disciples say, nah, he doesn't have time. And Jesus is like, whoa, wait a minute. Absolutely not. Bring these children here. I'm going to bless them. And just, goes out of his way to put his hands on them and bless them and transmit all this positive energy. So what Marcion says is, listen, folks, you've got a contrast here. I mean, anybody who's got eyes to see here, we've got an Old Testament deity who's ready to curse and to kill little children because of a fairly minor fault against the prophet. Okay. I mean, there have been efforts to say that these children had some great malicious intent, or that they were somehow doing some horrible thing to the prophet. No, I mean, they're kids. They're having fun. So how does the Old Testament God respond? Not with love and sympathy, with this overwhelming urge to bless. No, he responds with cursing, and he breaks their bones by sending she-bears. How does Jesus respond? Well, Jesus is not at all like that. Not even a little bit. I mean, the contrast is so clear. He goes out of his way not to curse, but to bless little children. He's got time. So ask yourself this. You've got this story about actions, and we can only judge character from actions. We've got the character of an Old Testament God and the character of a God revealed in Jesus. And you tell me, Marcion says, if those are the same God. Because I'm going to contradict you. Okay, those aren't the same deity at all. And if you had a shred of honesty, you would say the same thing. And he goes through passage after passage after passage, and he says, look at this. The way that you can contrast the God of the Old Testament from Jesus, the God revealed in Jesus. There's no question. Now, what we think is going on is that Marcion is also... He's been accused of being a bit of a purist and a bit of a literalist, but I'm also, and I think a sympathetic reading is available here. He was also just trying to be honest. And it's very hard, pastors try to do this, sometimes just by ignoring the Old Testament, sometimes by sugarcoating it. But it's very hard actually to unite some of these passages, how God treats Job versus how God treats, or how God treats Abraham, telling him to kill his son and seemingly just to test his faith, putting him through all that huge emotional stress. And then how God interacts with others in absolute love and affirmation and so on and so forth. What Marcion seemed to be working with is a philosophical presupposition, and that presupposition said this: God, if there is a God, cannot be evil. He can only be good. And that philosophical presupposition means that if you go through the Old Testament with a fine-tooth comb, that God ain't good. He's killed everybody in the world with a flood. He sent down fire on cities, some of them that, on 5 cities in Genesis 19. He kills people and orders the genocide of the Canaanites. He's a murderer. And he seems to send, bad dreams to people. And he's even against his own people if they dare disobey him. Threatens to exile them and wipe them out. And that's what happens. So yeah, some would say to Marcion, of course, that both today and in the past, that, well, actually, the God of the New Testament really isn't that different either. I mean, he did kill Jesus. I mean, he raised him, but he did kill him. But the point is this, that Marcion is trying to interpret his biblical text. And he just basically comes out with an answer that, here's the situation. My theology is this. If you're reading the Bible carefully, you're going to come up with this conclusion. First of all, there is a real being in the Old Testament who is and masquerades as the God of the Jews. He's actually not a God at all. But he's the deity, the angel, super angel that's looking after the Jews and protecting them. And then there's the God of Jesus Christ, or the God revealed in Jesus Christ. And that's the true one, because that's the good one. And so it's not that Marcion believes in 2 gods. This is what heresiologists are always trying to say about Marcion. They're trying to say, well, how dare you? You're just a dualist and a polytheist. Well, he's a dualist in the same sense that a Christian today thinks of the dualism between Satan and the true God, or Satan and God, basically. In other words, Marcion just says, yes, there is this deity who inspires the Old Testament, but he's actually not a deity. He's actually not God at all. He's some other dude who is powerful, but he's not true. And then there is the true God, and the true God is revealed through Christ, and that's the God I want you to worship. That's the God that's worthy of worship. Right. And so basically, there in his church, you never have a reading from the Old Testament for obvious reasons. So, but the question, so the short answer to the question is, why did early Christians think there was an evil creator? The short answer to that, and the surprising one, is they read their Bibles, and they read it closely.
Wow, well put. Oh man, and I haven't read Marcion or Against Marcion. I think it's Against Marcion, yeah, or Against Heresy. Sorry, I think, isn't it in Against Heresy?
So Marcion is attacked by all number of people. He creates an absolute firestorm. Yes. So Irenaeus goes after him, and Tertullian goes after him in a 5-book work called Against Marcion. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. He really felt the effects of Marcion then. And I think a lot of people were following that. I would follow that if I was still in the worldview. That was pretty right. I even told a Christian the other day, I speak to Christians all the time. I'm personally not one. I've left all of that and personally label myself an atheist. I know I'm probably pigeonholing myself here by a lot of people, but either way, you probably know where I'm coming from. But I told him, I was like, if I was to ever swallow the pill again, it would never be this damnation, eternal conscious torment. Like universalism, maybe, like we could, like that's a prettier picture. I could never accept what I did when I was a Calvinist. I literally came to the conclusion that God predetermined eternal conscious torment for potentially some of my own family members that I loved more than God, yet God supposedly, I don't even know. It's insanity. But the point is, did he ever notice that comparison between Samuel and Chronicles about the numbering of Israel, and here one saying, and Satan, tricks David, and then the other one says God tricks David? Did he ever notice that?
That I don't think so. But the unfortunate thing about Marcion is that we don't have, first of all, his version of the New Testament, and we don't have his antitheses. Those were all destroyed purposefully. But what we do have, and the reason why we can reconstruct Marcion's version of Paul and Marcion's version of Luke, is because the heresiologists Tertullian and Epiphanius go through line by line and say, here's my text, here's where Marcion differs. And so we can sort of reconstruct it. So it's not like a Q situation where the Q is like, well, we think there's a document, but it's hypothetical. With Marcion, it's more like, we definitely know there's a document. Everybody says there was, and we can reconstruct it from the attacks that are made on it. So we've got a little bit of a further basis, because the attacks say, here's what Marcion says, and here's the true reading. So basically, we're very thankful for them for revealing what Marcion says. Even as they try to destroy him, in effect, they preserved him. So that's one of the ironies of history. But yeah, to get back to your question, he, in his antitheses, he had a number of passages. I don't think he picked that particular one, but there are reconstructions of the antitheses, and I go through most the major ones in the Evil Creator book. And so, yeah, go
and
for it.
Is this on Amazon yet? Because it didn't show.
I don't think I've put it on my author page, but I will do that. But it's definitely available for. It's definitely on Amazon. I just have to put it on my author page here.
Well, let me do this: the Evil Creator, just to make sure we have it pulled up so people can see it. I need to add it to. I need to add it to my recommended book list so everybody knows. And I'm just going to put your last name, Litwa. We'll see. Here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on my recommended. So anyone can go down in the description and actually get this book. So Myth Vision recommended, and it's added to the list. So you're going to definitely want to go down there and check that out. Sorry, I wanted everyone to see it while you're saying it.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah. There's a couple other passages that that are worth bringing the attention of your viewers, even in the so-called New Testament. John 8:44, and this is an argument that has been made long before me. April DeConnick from Rice has made this argument. Basically, when you look at the Greek of John 8:44, the situation is this: Jesus is talking with the Jews, and the Jews are basically, they're fictional characters. This isn't any kind of historical event, but they get in a spat and they start debating about God. And Jesus says that, if you love God, you would love me. And they say that we're the children of God. And then Jesus shoots back at them something like so horrifying that it has sent shivers through the spines of many Christians. He says to the Jews that you are sons of the devil, children of the devil. And basically, you are followers of the father of lies. Now, what's interesting is in the Greek, there's actually two ways to construct the passage, and very few English versions actually, or none actually, that I'm aware of, actually tell you that there's another way to read the passage.
Can I guess? Just to see if I'm onto something here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You're the father of the devil. Am I onto something here, that there's a father of the devil?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Dr. Price said this before, by the way, but I'd love to hear what you say about this.
Yes, exactly. So among scholars, among readers of Greek, they recognize this ambiguity very easily, because the Greek says "hume sectu patros tu diavolou," which could mean you are from the father, comma, the devil, or actually it's much easier to read it as you are from the father of the devil. And so then the question is, well, Jesus, thanks for letting us know, but who's the father of the devil? I mean, I didn't know that the devil had a father. I mean, the devil has a daddy? Basically, this is the real question. And so those early Christians who read this as you are from the father of the devil, basically envisioned that, yes, the devil did have a father, and that father was the creator. And because the devil has to come from somewhere, and the creator made the devil, so that's the devil's father. Now, as you go on and read the verse, it says, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer, a man killer, literally, from the beginning, and he did not stand in the truth because the truth is not in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own. And because he's a liar, and his father is a liar too. Now, that's, again, what the Greek says. So it's not just once that we hear about the devil's father. It's actually twice. So
gosh.
As if to make this clear, Jesus says, yeah, the devil's a liar, and so is his daddy. So if you envision the creator as the devil's father, and the devil has, and the devil's father is the one referred to as a murderer from the beginning, who stands not in the truth, and who speaks the lie, or even if you don't view that as the case, both characters, the devil and the devil's father, are acting in similar ways. They're both liars and murderers, basically, is the gist of the passage.
Yeah.
So you can't possibly view the creator as a good guy on the basis of this passage if you're reading it in the father of the devil reading. So you have to conclude that the creator is actually bad in the sense that he is a killer and a liar. And if that's the verse that you're reading, well, then you wouldn't view the creator as a good being. You would view him as something else. And then the true deity, which Jesus reveals, is the one that you actually worship. But that's not the creator. The creator is somebody else. And the image of the book, interestingly, goes back to Egyptian mythology, as I'm sure you're well aware of. It's a picture of Seth, or Set, who is the Egyptian god of chaos and evil. And the most fun chapter to write in this book was the first chapter, because there's this ancient tradition that started long before Christianity, which depicts Yahweh, the Jewish deity, as Seth. It's an anti-Jewish tradition. It arises, we think, in Egypt. The Jews, as you probably know, live in Egypt long before the birth of Christianity. They come into contact with the specifically Egyptian and Alexandrian culture, and there are conflicts. And as we see in the starting in the 2nd century BCE, that is about 150 years before Christianity comes on the scene, that the enemies of the Jews are already depicting Yahweh as Seth, or as a form of Seth. And what that means is that basically the idea of an evil creator who is identical to the Jewish deity is an idea that predates Christianity, so that when Christianity comes along 150 years later, this idea is already pre-made. It's not that the Christians have to come up with it themselves. That is, it's already a manufactured idea in the culture that the Jewish deity is an evil being. And what the Christians add to it is, well, guess what? Some Christians, that is, add to it that we know the true deity. That's not the Jewish deity. That's the universal deity. Who's the good deity? Right?
Dude, this is wild, by the way.
And actually, I mean, it gets a little bit wilder. And actually, yeah, so this explains why there's so many conflicts in the Middle East. There's a famous another early Christian who was de-Christianized, Basilides, he makes a comment which is transmitted through Irenaeus, and he says, listen, why are they so warlike? Because during his time, similar to like the Palestinian Israeli conflicts today, or this past summer, we see all this constant war, and we're like, why is this happening in the Middle East? Well, they asked the same question in antiquity, like, why are the Jews so warlike? Why do they sort of pick fights with Rome? Because there were 3 wars, or there was the first Jewish war where the Jewish state was wiped out and the temple was burned in 70. Then there was this basically massive pogrom in the year 117 where the Jews of Egypt were wiped out. And then there was another war in Palestine, the so-called Bar Kokhba War, in which the Jews were again, after a long guerrilla war campaign, basically destroyed. So by 135, there's not even any Jews in Judea. They've been all exiled. So Basilides raised the question, is like, why are the Jews so warlike? Well, it's because their deity is also warlike. I mean, if you read the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, I mean, that God is armed for war. And he's like, you're going to be number one. You're going to be the best nation. I'm going to come. The kingdom's going to be established. You're going to rule the world. So is it any wonder when the Romans come along that the Jews think that they can pull off fighting the evil empire? Well, it's their God whispering in their ear through the prophets saying that they are there's going to be some climactic Armageddon-like battle, and they're going to win, and so on and so forth. But all that's a lie, right? I mean, the Jews just keep getting defeated because they're actually being lied to by their own protector deity, the deity supposed to protect them, who's not actually a deity at all. He's just sort of an angelic figure who is masquerading as the true deity. And that's the reason why Christians are different. There's actually a huge theological difference here. We believe in the true God, and we aren't fooled by the corrupt prophecies of this misfit of an angel who calls himself the creator. So all this sounds like totally wildly radical today, but when I did the research for this, I looked at what modern atheists said about the Old Testament, and I just realized that, my goodness, they're saying the same thing that Marcion said. But the strange thing is they don't know anything about Marcion, and actually, what Marcion said sounded a whole lot better. I mean, and I just was like, why don't these atheists know Marcion? It's like, why do we need to reinvent the wheel?
Yeah.
In the 2nd century, they already knew that this God was horrible. And they already knew that he was a masquerading misfit who wasn't really a deity at all. And they were Christian, just as Christian as any other. No one, obviously later they were de-Christianized, but in their own time, they were as Christian as anyone today has any right to claim the Christian title. They were Christians. So, and that's their theology. So it would be really great if people did a little bit more homework on Marcion.
It might help to get your book. First off, I need to let everyone know, obviously, because you do a lot of the homework for people, but it'll be great as a kicker, get your book and then go read Marcion. And maybe we can get some sources and stuff to really look into. The way you're going to find Marcion is through his opponents. So this is an interesting point you bring up, but I'm glad we still have it. Let me ask you this. This is something that piqued my interest. You blew my mind, by the way. Just thanks a lot. I appreciate it. I probably won't sleep tonight. No, seriously, this is a fascinating point you bring up. Marcion, 2nd century. It's clear Marcion is kind of seen as the pioneer of this whole idea in the sense of what you're describing. However, when we talk about chronology of the Gospels, you say you think Luke came last. Does that mean, and I don't want to get lost in the dating here, but does that mean you think John comes before Luke?
Yeah, I do. I definitely do. And what I'm talking about there is canonical Luke. That is,
right.
That is our version Luke. Now, what happens is this, if I can give you the simplified version.
Please.
So in the traditional theory of the Gospels, the mainline theory is that Mark comes first, is written around 70 because he knows the destruction of the temple. Then comes Matthew and Luke, and then comes John.
Right.
And that's basically the traditional line is. The problem is that these Gospels seem to be in different versions. And what we have that is the version of what we now call Luke is in a state of instability in the early 2nd century. So if you're reading this document, say in Alexandria, it's different than the version in Pontus, that is northern Turkey, where Marcion originated. So, and then you have the additional factor of the texts are updated. And we can see this in the case of Mark. So Mark, most scholars, I think, would agree, ends with Mark 16:8, which is the women running away after the angel tells them, you'll see him in Galilee. Well, that wasn't a sufficient ending. So people just added an ending. And there are 2 endings of Mark, both dated to the 2nd century, that people just added to make the story seem more complete or more orthodox or whatever. And this is also what happens with Luke, because when Marcion comes onto the scene and he comes to Rome and he publishes his version of the gospel plus Paul's letters to produce what many think of as the first edition of the New Testament. When other Christians get a hold of this, they're like, hey, wait a minute, this sounds familiar, but it's not exactly the gospel that we read. And Marcion and Tertullian reveals that Marcion Marcion accused his opponents of doctoring his gospel. And what that means is that people got a hold of his version of Luke and then added stuff. And
they must have liked it enough to want to use it, but then they wanted to add things.
Yeah, but basically, as texts get updated, things are typically added, as in the case of Mark. So what I think was added to Luke was the birth narratives, and basically, material at the end, and material in the middle was also underwent some changes, but not so radical. And whoever is updating Luke is doing so in conscious opposition to Marcion. That's hypothesis number 1. Hypothesis number 2 is that whoever is updating Luke is also writing Acts at the same time, so that basically he wants to create an anti-Marcionite version of church history as well. So he wants to create an anti-Marcionite gospel by using Marcion's gospel and adding stuff, including the preface, so that if you read the preface of Luke and Acts, you can tell that it's the same editor, not the same author, the same editor. Same editor publishes then our canonical Luke and Acts as a single document that go together, a sort of diptych. And with that document, then early Catholics, the sort of incipient Catholic movement accepts canonical Luke and Acts. And they accept it in part because it's so useful against countering Marcion's version of the New Testament. So what's actually happening in the mid-2nd century is that there are counter New Testaments. There's Marcion's version, and then there's a version actually designed to counter Marcion. Scholars will always disagree about this, but I think there's sufficient. I think there's sufficient evidence to say that canonical Luke and Acts is responding to issues raised by Marcion. And those who have done the most work on this are, several people. Most famously, Marcus Vincent and Matthias Klinghardt. Klinghardt is a German. Also, I believe it's Joseph B. Tyson, who is American. And yeah, basically, and also Richard Purvo, who's given us a very useful book on dating Acts. although I think he doesn't date Acts late enough. But he definitely does mention that Acts very well could be dealing with Marcionite thinking, in which case it can't be earlier than, say, 140.
Wow.
And if canonical Acts is given at the same time as canonical Luke, then that happened around 150.
I love this stuff. So, okay, this is where I'm heading with this. So, I'm glad you took us through where you put these ideas. So, John comes before that, which is still 2nd century, I guess.
Yeah, I would say I'd make a distinction between John and the prologue. I think John is written maybe around 100, and then the prologue is about 120.
Okay, so we have John here. And the question is, you brought up John 8. Now, some people, if I'm not mistaken, will say, is this the adulterous woman or is that John 7? I can't remember. The adulterous woman is, supposedly some people say.
Yeah, she's inserted into John. I believe you're right that it's 8. Yeah.
Okay.
Or somewhere between. Yeah.
Yeah. So someone who would want to come along and go, okay, your reading of John 8 is late in the game, or they want to interpolate. I don't even want to. Let's say this is there. This is John, and that means it's before Marcion. So there's an early author here that is seeing, if that interpretation of what you just described, they're seeing this, and they're seeing that God is not good, and your God, the father of Satan, is not good. Marcion's not like making this crap up. This seems to be like early Christian movement already in the literary gospel tradition that are saying this. They're already saying these problems. So Marcion's not like fabricating this out of like midair. Early Christian movements are already presenting this kind of idea about the God of the Old Testament. So it leads me to ask you this question. Marcion didn't just have a proto version of Luke. Marcion had Paul. So then the question comes is, the scholars who want to say Paul within Judaism, if he had Paul, what did Paul believe about the God of the Jews? You know, this makes me really want to open up and reinvestigate everything that Paul is talking about. What is your take on it?
Well, you'll be glad to know that the book definitely focuses on major Pauline texts.
Okay.
Because definitely Marcion is viewed as he's the best known interpreter of Paul. There's absolutely no question about that. Just to give you a taste or a foretaste.
Tease us.
A teaser, yeah. So I look at the passage in 2 Corinthians 4:4, and that passage is where Paul's debating with his opponents, as he usually does. And he is making the comment that there are some people who have a veil over their head, that is the Jews in context, and there's us for whom the veil is taken away. And he begins, just to quote verse 3 here, he says, if he sort of wants to slightly revise what he just said and sort of make an exception. He says, but even if our gospel is veiled, because I'm difficult to understand, it's only veiled among those people who are being destroyed. And among these people who are being destroyed, Paul says, is the God of this age. And he says literally, en his atheos to aeonos, among whom the God of this age has blinded their minds so that they don't actually see the enlightenment of the gospel of the glory of Christ. So basically, what's interesting is that Paul says, well, yeah, there's a God of this age. The Greek word there's ion. He says there's a God of this age. And what does this God do? Well, he spends his time blinding people from seeing the light of the gospel of Christ. So you're like, oh, well, that's interesting. I didn't know there was a God who did that. But then you read a little bit further, and you get down to verse 6, and he's like, Paul says, well, guess what, folks? There's another God, and this particular God is much different than the God I mentioned 2 verses earlier, who blinds people from seeing the light of the gospel of Christ. The God in verse 6 says, out of light darkness will shine, and this God has shown into our hearts the enlightenment of the knowledge of the glory of God. So basically, Paul himself says, there's two beings. I'm going to contrast them. I'm going to call both of them God. One of them is a God who blinds people from seeing the light of Christ. And the other one is the God who enlightens people with the light of Christ, just to paraphrase. And the only reasonable question to ask here is exactly the question that Marcion asked. To which God are you referring? Or do you actually believe that there are two gods? Or most people are like, well, is this some kind of cute metaphor? I mean, he certainly can't believe that there's a God who blinds people.
Right.
And then, so you compare this passage with 1 Corinthians 2:9, 1 Corinthians 2:8, and we get another little interesting tidbit of Paul's theology. Basically, he says, Jesus was crucified, okay? And this is all a mystery, and God planned all this before the ages. And none of the, what he calls archons, none of the rulers of this age knew anything about this particular mystery, because if they knew it, they wouldn't have crucified the Lord of glory. So the question is, and he says specifically that these rulers were blinded, or that they didn't know the mystery, so to speak. And so basically what Marcion did is he just connected these two passages. He says, listen, guys, here's Paul's theology. Paul says there are these evil beings running around called archons or rulers. They're blind, and they blind people. They're blind to the glory of Christ, and they blind other people to the glory of Christ. And then there's the true God who enlightens people to the glory of Christ. And I'm going to tell you about the true God. That's the God revealed in Jesus Christ. Everybody else who reads Paul is not going to buy that theology, but it's absolutely based in a very, what I think is a reasonable reading of Paul. He's got many, many figures running around. One of them is primarily evil, and another is primarily good. And Marcion is saying, this is the reality. Now, I think the nuance that I bring to this is I think Marcion didn't think that the God who blinds people was actually God. Because I think that he shouldn't be called a God. He was only masquerading as a God, so to speak. The nuance here is important because Marcion, I think, is philosophically convinced that a God who does evil isn't God. Right. So a God who goes out and blinds people from seeing the light of Christ and effectively preventing them from repenting, preventing them from coming to the knowledge of the truth, preventing them from being saved. That God, there's no way you could convince me that, says Marcion, that God could be good. So he's not really a God. He's some kind of being masquerading as a God, but he's not God. And whoever that being is, well, we don't worship him. We worship the God who is the God who does the reverse of blinding. That is the God who enlightens.
I must ask this question. It sounds, would you point it out in 1 Corinthians 4:4 and then 1 Corinthians 8? I can't remember, but it's in the same book.
2:8,
yeah.
Or it's two separate letters. So 1 Corinthians 2:8 and 2 Corinthians 4:4. Yeah.
Okay. So here you have this clear doctrine of these archons that's obviously blinding people. These are the same people who crucified the Lord. Okay. These people are controlled. I think Elaine Pagels is onto something when she says in her book on the origin of Satan that there's it's not only spirits or some type of power, right, in the metaphysical, if we could use the term, which I don't think they thought that way in the ancient world. But my point is these are people that are being, if you will, possessed by the powers that be. Okay. This is the way it looks like. And the question is Paul looking at Jews when he says this? Because let's just give one little continuity connection between John and Paul, the Gospel of John. the Gospel of John has this interesting kind of Dionysian Lord's Supper type of idea that Mark and Matthew don't really go as explicit. Paul has that in the Corinthian letters. Paul is like more, it seems to me, connected with the Lord's Supper in John 6, chew my flesh and drink my blood, to Paul's ideas than it is to like Mark and Matthew. And so I'm wondering if there's that continuity in the Johannine tradition and Paul's tradition. And it also has this view of the Jews being guilty of it. Is Paul kind of saying the same thing here when he talks about this? So, without just beating around the bush and saying this is Yahweh or the God of Israel that he's trying to point out, it sounds like he's saying that. And he even does this in Romans letter. He might do it a little more incognito, but in the Romans letter, which might be a compilation of letters, he still keeps pointing out the blindness that has been put upon Israel. Well, who are they? There's a blindness and a stumbling block. And it's like, what the heck is this? It makes me keep connecting dots in Paul's letters that just makes me go, I have to know what Marcion thought, because I may not even know what I'm reading about with Paul without looking at Marcion.
Right. Yeah. And the challenge is that because people have been brought up in churches that are outgrowths of the Orthodox movement, they've been so conditioned and trained in their minds to read in an anti-Marcionite way that when you tell them that this is also a way that the New Testament can be read or that Paul can be read, they're like, get out of town. That's total. I'm not even going to listen to that. I mean, that's just crazy. But what I would encourage your viewers to really think about is, that modern socialization and historical conditioning that we have. So whether or not you're an atheist or a fundamentalist or somewhere in between, that really doesn't matter. We're all products of the Orthodox tradition. And what we think about as Christianity is that Christianity, which won out in the 4th century, that is the Constantinian version of Christianity, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the Orthodox version that beat off all these other competing versions in the great laboratory of Christian ideas. And that's why the 2nd century is one of the most interesting of all centuries, because there's no rules. There's no Orthodox, emperor out there going to kill you if you're going to say anything, and you can say anything. And the Bible is wide open for interpretation. So absolutely, Marcion's reading has a logic. And the ironic thing is that reading, as I said, appears in modern atheist literature. They just don't know that they're making Marcionite arguments. Mm. The other thing to keep in mind about the Judaism question is the affirmation of the Judaism of Jesus and Paul has become very important for modern biblical studies after the Holocaust for obvious reasons. I mean, right. We want to protect against anti-Jewish readings. Yeah. And that's another reason why people don't like Marcion, because they're like, what? How could he say this? That just sounds so anti-Jewish. But the issue is, when you're doing real historical work, you have to put your mind really in the place of the 2nd century and not ask all modern questions, right? It's important for us as modern people to emphasize the Judaism of Jesus and Paul. It wasn't that important in the early 2nd century. And to early 2nd century Christians, the fact that Jesus was Jewish, well, I don't see anyone shouting that from the rooftops. I mean, yeah, he was, but who cares? That wasn't the most significant thing. The most significant thing was that he's the Son of God. So who cares whether he grew up in Nazareth? I mean, we emphasize certain things because of where we are in history, but those things weren't the most important things for the early 2nd century. I don't think Marcion, there's a lot of people who would say that Marcion was anti-Jewish or that he wanted to throw away the Old Testament. Totally bogus. Marcion was the best reader of the Old Testament that I know of in the early 2nd century, the most honest, the most thorough, the most critical, the most engaging. He's not throwing it away. He's researching it. He's just not using it in his churches because he thinks that the theology is totally wrong. Yeah. I mean, who wants to read in church a document which has God killing people with a flood and commanding genocide? And I mean, if you want to read that as a historical document, fine, but don't read it in church. And frankly, most churches don't. I mean, they have this implicit agreement that, yeah, we have the Old Testament, but we don't read it. Or we don't read the tough bits. The part about Elisha and the she-bears, or the part about, the killings and the genocides and the wars and all that jazz, and God torturing Job just to see if he'll remain faithful. Well, I mean, let's be honest. What's the last sermon we heard on that stuff? I mean, it's really not emphasized. So that in itself is a kind of Marcionite move. I mean, you can in some way, stand up for the Old Testament, but in the end, you don't really read or study it. So are you really
they filtered it through like God's justice has been now punished onto his son, so that all of that bad atrocity, the way that they try to interpret it today, is like, the Old Testament's Old Testament, brimstone and fire, but God's brimstone and fire was put upon his son. Therefore, all of that you deserve, which was the flood and the fire and the she-bears and the whole nine or whatever, you deserved all that. But Jesus, but I will say this, quick question as we end this episode. I really seriously hope everyone goes and gets this book. I am definitely getting this. The question is this: when he says you're a liar from the beginning, that reminds me of Genesis. And it makes me think not just Genesis, it makes me think of the garden. And it makes me think that this eating of the fruit idea is a trick. Because even Dr. Price, for example, do you talk about this in your book? I don't want to sneak into this if you get into this in your book at all.
I do talk about Genesis, but not...
the garden?
Well, I do, but in a different way. So go ahead.
Okay, simply put, Dr. Price was talking about how there is the idea that God lied. He told them, look, if you eat in that day, you will die. And this idea was the serpent comes and says, no, you'll be like the gods, knowing good and evil. The serpent here, or this snake, that I think is a literal snake in actual Genesis, in the actual context. But that's going into A&E literature and ancient Near Eastern concepts and stuff, Mesopotamia, all that. But the snake actually tells the truth. No, you won't surely die. You'll become like the gods, knowing good and evil. And then God has to kick them out, like literally keeping them from being able to access the tree of knowledge, or of good and evil. Sorry, not good and evil, sorry, the tree of life. So it's not that they died that day. In fact, God kicks them out and makes sure they can't live. So it's almost making me think, and I wonder if the author of John is seeing this and going, this God, this picture of this God here is a liar from the beginning. And It makes you wonder if that's the way they interpreted it.
Exactly. And I don't want to be overly political here, but it's exactly like a story that I saw recently about two former Russian spies who were poisoned in the UK, and so basically, the allegation is that Putin or some high up Russian official ordered their poisoning, and that seems to be the case. So why is that? Because they were revealing information, and then when you go to the Russian officials and say, well, what do you say about this? They say, oh, that's a lie. That's just the West trying to make Russia look bad. I think definitely Marcion is that kind of reader who wouldn't accept that traditional reading of Genesis, because God basically is acting like a Russian dictator or any dictator in Genesis. First of all, it's proved that he's a liar because they don't die on the same day. But second of all, he's weak. And why is he weak? Because if he really wanted people to know stuff, he wouldn't be so insecure and kick them out of the garden, right? I mean, he's really quite insecure about his own identity. He really doesn't want people to improve, whereas that has become more like him. Whereas the God of Jesus, I think Marcion would say, wants you to assimilate to him, and is more like the Platonic deity. Because remember, Plato says that the ethical goal of life is to become more like God. And how do you do that? You become righteous and wise, right? And God wants you to be more like God. And that's the gospel of deification. That's another
Oh goodness, this
interview.
makes me want to get
So,
into misogyny too. Like there's so many things that make me think that the way the patriarchal system, they're already coming in and Paul's saying neither male nor female. He's you got me excited, man.
well, I'm glad. Okay, I'll just zip up now, and you can, I'll let you and your viewers read whatever you want to read, and then I can maybe come back someday and talk more about it.
Well, I sure hope you do. I hope everybody gets the book. I will be getting this myself. I really look forward to taking a deeper dive, and maybe we can do further episode of the enlightenment that I might have after this. We can get super excited taking a deeper dive into the content. You really make me want to, because I have to read your other ones. I've already been told about these. Where's it at? Let me hit back here. I have already been warned about your other literature that is a must read, especially, how do you pronounce this again?
Jesus. So Jesus Deus, just means it's Latin for Jesus the God. Yep.
So this right here, we need to talk about divination, becoming divine, and deification, if you will. Not divination. What am I saying? How the Gospels became history. I need to finish reading this. There's a lot that you go into that the ancient world, understanding, not just your Bible interprets the Bible. Like, I mean, that's where a lot of viewers are like me. They came from, all they know is Genesis to Revelation, pulpit preaching. We know of Philo. We've heard of Plato. We've heard of the guy named Josephus. Like, just, that's the best we got. You start naming some of these other people and we're like, who? What? We're like really misinformed already and ignorant. And we really need more information. So I have been told by countless people, including guys who disagree with you, Dennis McDonald, Richard Carey, I got to do that. Got to point out, they just last week told me you got to read his work. So I highly recommend it. I look forward to this again. Thank you for giving me the opportunity, seriously, to interview with you.
Well, thank you, Derek. It's been great. And yeah, I've listened to many other interviews, and certainly I think Dennis and Richard's work is really thought-provoking. And I really appreciate you bringing a whole range of scholars and experts and getting the word out. It's really important. So thank you.
Thank you. I feel like that's my calling, connecting scholars where they never would have, other than criticize each other.